All right. Well, welcome folks once again to another Wildlife for You wildlife class. Today, we're going to be talking about something really cool, something that people experience all the time. And most of the time, they wish they knew more about animal tracking or knowing which kind of animal has left those footprints behind. And so we're going to spend about an hour teaching you what to look for and how to identify those tracks you find, not to become an expert, but to become a really good beginner when it comes to identifying animal tracks. So sit back, relax, enjoy the presentation. And like I said, if you have any questions whatsoever, by all means, feel free to jump in and let me know if I lose you. So as with all these classes, we always talk about the experience of the instructor. And y'all know me, I do most of these classes, but just so everyone has an idea, I do have a degree in wildlife management, and I've spent my career doing a lot of wildlife biology work. Started the career working at the Appalachian Bear Center in East Tennessee. Then I started working for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency as a big game coordinator. So I was managing bear, deer, elk. They promoted me to chief of wildlife for the state of Tennessee. I did that for about another 5 years. And then as a little boy, I've always wanted to live and work out west. And when you work for the state of Tennessee, the furthest west you could go is Memphis. And that wasn't far enough. I wanted to be in the Rockies. So I took a position with the U.S. Forest Service. I worked on the Santa Fe National Forest for a while as a wildlife, fish, and plants program manager. And that led me to my current job, which not many people realize, but I do work for the Bureau of Land Management, and I'm a national wildlife specialist for the agency. So I still have a day job doing wildlife biology, but one of the things I do in the evening is something I'm really passionate about, and that is teaching people about wildlife. Unfortunately, there's not many good avenues out there because lots of state and federal agencies, they've got good programs. Sometimes they're too technical. When it comes to like state wildlife agencies, sometimes they're geared more towards the hunters and the fishermen. What I try to do is I present wildlife classes for the everyday average Joe soccer mom person who loves wildlife that just wants to learn more about it. And we try our best to put it into dialogue that's easy for you guys to understand. So with that, that's me, who I am, who's teaching you this class tonight on animal tracking. So let's actually dive into the class. And so we're gonna spend quite a bit of time on talking about this issue of animal tracking. And the question right off the bat is this animal tracking, is this more of a science, or is it more of an art form? And truth be told, and you will see this as we go through this class, it's a little bit a combination of both. You gotta know the science, and that's what I'm hoping to teach you. But you also have to use your imagination and kind of recreate a scene as to what happened before you got there that will actually help you make a better decision on what animal tracks you may have found. And so there definitely is an art to it. There's definitely a science to it. So I think everyone here is interested in it and everyone can do it. So let's dive into the science part of animal tracking. And this is where, to the average everyday person, the science can become overwhelming because, face it, folks, there are a ton of animals out there. And this is just a simple slice of some of the animals you might encounter out there. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of more animals that I don't have posted up here. But right away, you see all that and it's daunting. It's like, oh my gosh, what animal do I have to figure out these tracks to be from? And the thing is, what I want to do is I want to teach you a method or a process in which you can go about looking at an animal track and decide really easily, or at least steer you in a direction to make you select a very logical, reasonable choice as to what animal made those tracks before you. And so, for example, you have this whole slew of dozens and dozens of animals that could have left the track that you're looking at. But right away, you notice, okay, there's no other extra, like there's no tail drags, there's no other extra identifying marks. So it will eliminate a whole group of species because they don't carry the characteristic, like, for example, they're not dragging their tail. The next thing you do, you look at it and you're looking at the track and you're like, well, I know it's not a hooved animal like a deer or an elk. So you're going to eliminate another whole group of animals. And so as you're looking at the track, you kind of count some toes on it and you realize that the track you're looking at has 5 toes. And so it's going to eliminate another big group of animals. And then you look at the size of the track, say, okay, these are the animals that have 5 toes. These are what animals it could be, but because of the size of the track, it's a really big track. It can't be any of those. So now we're down to just a couple animals it could be. And then you look at a particular characteristic of the track, like the positioning of the toe, and then you can make your determination. And you're like, okay, this is a grizzly track. Now, this was a total random type of example. Obviously, a grizzly track is going to be one of the biggest tracks you find out there, but I wanted to demonstrate the process of eliminating large groups of animals to help you draw a more logical, more reasonable conclusion as to what kind of track that just the animal, what kind of animal made the track before you. Sorry about that. And so what we want to do is, first off, we want to talk about, again, we're sticking with the science of animal tracking. And the first thing I can do, and I'm going to get into jargon, but I think it will start making things click in your mind to say, oh, that makes sense. I get it now. So the first thing I want to talk about is how an animal walks. And there are different kinds of ways in which an animal can walk. So there are groups of animals that are flat-footed. And the technical term for this, and I hate using jargon, but if you ever hear it mentioned, you might remember what it is. But if you ever hear of an animal that walks plantigrade, that means they're flat-footed. They use their entire foot to walk. And so what I want to show you here is to give you an idea what I'm talking about. So here we have the skeletal structure of a bear, which is a plantigrade or a flat-footed animal. And so if you start back at the hips, you come down through the femur and you get to the knee. Can you guys see my cursor where I'm circling? Someone either type it or...
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Melissa. So you see the knee and then you come down the bottom and you get to the heel of the animal. And from the heel all the way to the toes is flat on the ground. So it's a flat-footed animal. And you see it in the front section too. Here you come down off the shoulder, you get to the elbow, and you come, and so the palm of its paw is literally flat on the ground. And there is a whole series of flat-footed or plantigrade animals. And so if you see a track where you see the heel, the pad, the toes, everything, you know it can only be a certain group of animals. So let's look at another group of animals. And again, I'm going to use some jargon that wildlife biologists throw out there, but it's called digitigrade animals. The easiest way to remember this is, you know what digits are. Digits are your fingers and toes. And so what a digitigrade animal does, it walks on their toes. And so we'll take another skeleton here, and let's start at the back end of the animal. We'll start at the hips. You come down, you get the knees, and then you go down, and here is the heel of this animal. It's way off the ground. So it's not stepping on its whole foot. It's literally just walking on its pad and its toes. Again, look at the front part of the animal. You come down from the shoulder blade, you hit the elbow, and then you come down, and the wrist part is right here, and it's only walking on its toes. And there's only a certain group of animals that are classified as digitigrade. And just so you know, for the most part, we're talking about animals like the cats and the dogs, and I'll explain that more in a little bit. But then you have the third group of animals that are called unguligrade, another technical term. It represents a class of animals called ungulates, which for the most part, it's the hooved animals. And so anything from deer to bison to sheep, if you look at those animals, again, we'll start at the back end. You got the hips, come down to the knee, then you go down, and there's the heel is way up here. You come down here to the front part of its foot, and then literally it's walking on its fingernails, or the hooves are what we would consider its fingernails. Same thing on the front. You got the shoulder blade coming down to the elbow, all the way to the foot area right here. And then it's literally just walking on those hooves or the fingernails of that animal. And so those are the three primary ways an animal walks. So if you see a track that has the whole pad showing, you know it can only be this kind of animal. Or if you see another track that obviously you see hoof marks, it can only be a certain group of animals. And so being able to determine how that animal walks will definitely help you. And one last photo of it, just to give you the difference between the plantigrade, the flat-footed animals, and the digitigrade, which are these are the primary groups of animals you'll struggle with. You'll see that the plantigrade, the flat-footed animals like bears and raccoons, they walk on their whole hand or their whole foot, where the animals like the mountain lions and the wolves and the coyotes, they walk on their toes for the most part. And so you're only going to see different parts of the track. So with that, let's talk about the parts of the foot. So I'll give you something really easy to understand, which is going to be a human foot, but we're also going to compare it to an animal foot, a flat-footed animal. And in this case, that track on the right is a typical bear track. And so if you look at the different parts of the track that is left, obviously that very back part is going to be the heel. Then this part up here is what we call the pad. It's just the area that is just behind the toes. Then obviously we have the toes, and then in some cases of the animals, you have the nails. And if you have a human that hasn't cut their nails in a while, you can probably see nail prints, but I sure would hate to see that human. Anyway, so those are the basic parts of a flat-footed animal. You have the heel, you have the pad, you have the toes, and you have the nails. Now, if we pull that away and we look at those digitigrade animals, the ones that walk on their toes, they're not just walking on their toes. So what they're walking on is their pad, and we have a canine track here to the right. They're walking on their pad, which is this big part, and you'll see the main pad on the canine track. And then you have their toes, obviously. And in many cases, you will see nail marks. Those nail marks obviously are going to be more indicative of a canine track than a feline track, because everyone knows that felines retract their claws when they're walking. So this is going to be really important, because the shape of the pad, the number of toes you see in the track, and the presence or absence of claw marks are really, really key in identifying specific animal tracks. And so here's something, even though we just spent about 5 minutes talking about the foot, keep in mind it's not all about the foot, because when you're looking at a substrate, you're looking at an area where an animal has passed. Oftentimes you see tracks from their feet, but if you have an animal like this, it's going to leave some other marks in the substrate in many situations, whether or not it's soft mud or snow. Obviously, in this situation, you're going to see a tail drag, especially with some of the smaller critters, the smaller mammals you might find. But keep in mind, it is not limited to just mammals. You can find tracks in the snow, and you will see some drag marks. This is Roadrunner, if you don't know, but oftentimes you will see drag marks from their tail feathers as they try to make their way through the snow or sand. And lastly, the other thing to keep in mind, to reiterate that it's not all about the foot, is there's some animals that don't have feet. So you can actually find some tracks on the ground from animals that aren't even using feet to move around. So, okay, enough about the feet. Let's talk a little bit about the different forms of locomotion. And this is real key. Why is this important? Because you can have very, very similar animals, like there'll be different species, but they're very similar animals. But the way the animals move about the landscape, you might be able to differentiate and pinpoint a very specific species. And I'll give you a prime example. Everyone knows what this is. This is a white-tailed deer. They have most whitetail are in the eastern half of the United States, but they do expand their range all the way out to the west. Not as many whitetails in the west, but they do make their way out in the west. They have a very close relative called a blacktail or a mule deer. And so most of the mule deer that you see are located in the western half of the United States. Now, what happens if you live in an area where there's both whitetail and mule deer? Well, they leave a very, very similar looking track. But what's cool is if you can look at a series of tracks that are left behind, the deer sometimes move in very distinct patterns. So if you look at a white-tailed deer, when that deer gets scared or runs off, a lot of times they will have this leaping or loping bound to them where they fully extend both front and back legs and they gallop away like many people understand a deer to do. The really, really cool thing, and I love seeing it, but the really cool thing with mule deer is sometimes when they're galloping away, they do this thing. Does anyone know what the prancing motion is that a mule deer does? There's a specific term for it. I'm going to quiz you. Does anyone know what that is? Trish, awesome. I don't know if folks could see it in the chat, but Trish responded stotting. And that's a technical term, and it's really cool. I should have posted a video in my presentation, but sometimes when mule deer run away, they prance, they bounce, and you can see it in the pictures. They have this weird form of locomotion. So if you have two sets of tracks there, and one deer is bounding away like the deer on the left, and the other deer, the tracks look like they're prancing in unison, you can actually make a determination, oh, this track here is from a mule deer and this track here is from a whitetail. So yes, Jan, a lot of the gazelles, the antelope that you see in Africa will have that exact same type of locomotion. The cool thing is here in North America, generally just the mule deer, black-tailed deer will do that. So besides that type of running or the specific type of gait, there is also some keys we can look for in animal tracks. For example, the pattern of the track could be very indicative of a certain species, or at least narrow down what species it could be. And when I talk about that, lots of times I'm talking about the foot placement, which is very, very key. If you were to see tracks like this, it's going to come from an animal called a lagomorph, or a rabbit. Whether or not it's a rabbit or a jackrabbit or a hare, they have very specific foot placement. Besides having the two big feet, their front feet, oftentimes when they're running or standing or walking, their front feet kind of go in a straight line, and their two back feet follow up. And so looking at the specific foot placement can help you identify what kind of animal that is. Now, another really interesting thing, which will help you because a lot of these animals are confused. When you look at a canid, and what a canid is, obviously is a member of the dog family. And what we're going to do is we're going to We're going to use my dogs, my domestic dogs, Bristol and Brooklyn. Many of you might know them. And then we'll look at the domestic dogs compared to some wild canids. You see a coyote there in that first picture, and you also have a fox. So the dogs on the left are domestic canids. The dogs, or the animals on the right, are wild canids, the coyote and the fox. What's interesting, if you look at the domestic dogs, they usually have a specific build to them. They're more wide chested. And so if you look at their tracks, their right side and left side of their track is somewhat spaced apart. Now, if you look at those wild canids, whether or not it's a coyote or a fox, oftentimes they're going to be in a straight line, especially when they're just walking. They can, their legs are positioned a little bit closer, and they conserve a lot of energy, and they often walk with their pads in more of a straight line. So if you see some tracks in the snow and you recognize them right away as canid tracks, if you see them more or less in a straight line as compared to being spaced apart on the left, you can differentiate between, oh, that's either a fox or a coyote as opposed to a domestic dog. Or oftentimes you can identify it as a domestic dog. So there's certain characteristics you can look for as far as foot placement goes. Now, another thing that will definitely help you identify tracks is knowing a little bit about the behavior and the habitat of the animal that made that track. And so, for example, if you live, say, in the eastern half of the US, and you have a lot of riparian areas, which riparian areas simply means streams or creeks, there are certain animals that hang out around those streams and creeks. Obviously, you have beavers, you have otters. So knowing what kind of animals live in that habitat will help you narrow down your guess. Likewise, if you live in a very arid spot, like if you're where I was at in the West and it's very arid, there's only specific kinds of animals live there. There's also going to be some habitats which are kind of conducive for all kinds of animals. So you have many more animals to choose from. So think about the habitat and the behavior of the animals you're trying to discern here. Another thing too, and I really don't want to scare you away, but all of this will start clicking. But another thing you have to consider when you're looking at animal tracks is the substrate, or what I mean by the substrate is the ground that those tracks are left in, because they can play tricks on the actual track itself. So snow is a great thing. You can find animal tracks in the snow really easy because freshly fallen snow, it's a piece of cake to identify where an animal has passed. One of the problems with snow, especially if it's deep snow, is you really don't get definition of what that track looks like. You might be able to see the gait or the pattern of the tracks, but you can't see the definition within the track itself. On the contrary, you go into an animal or into an environment that has a lot of sand or mud, you can get really good definition of that individual track. Sadly, many people live in an area where it's very difficult to get good tracks. You might see where an animal has passed, but there's no real distinct area. So you'll be lucky to find an area that has some mud or another place that has really good definition of the track itself. And so tracking, it's not as common where you go out, you go for a walk, you might walk around for miles and miles and miles and never see an animal track, but you get into an area where there's nice soft mud and you find the tracks that you're looking for, or you just find a series of tracks. And it all depends. There's animals walking around in all those environments, but there's only certain types of substrate or ground that are conducive to leaving good identifiable animal tracks. And so you have to keep in mind that the tracks are subject to the elements. So you could have a beautifully shaped track that's really defined. You can see the toes, you can see the pads, you can see the claw marks. And then within a few hours, that track can deteriorate because of the elements, and it will be completely different than when you first saw it. The cool thing is I'll show you there's certain characteristics you can look for even when a track gets washed away from rain or potentially snow. Even when that track gets muted by the elements, there's still some things you could look at that will help you identify that track. So it sounds like a lot. I know it's a lot, but these are some of the things that I want you to start thinking about to go through that process of identifying what kind of animal left that track before you. Okay, Jan asked a question, said, what was the term used when referring to rabbits? And I am sorry, I put my nerd hat on for a little bit, and I try not to, but it slips. I called them lagomorphs. That's the family that they come from. And it's not a very common term, but the whole group of lagomorphs consists of, you have rabbits, you have hares, jackrabbits, you name it, they're all in the family Lagomorpha. So that's why I called it a lagomorph. I have a feeling most people in on these wildlife classes are wildlife nerds, so I think I'll be forgiven. But if I was talking to a group of people at a grocery store, they would have no clue what I was talking about. So, all right, let's move on to some animals. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start showing you some of the different tracks you'll see and what animals leave those tracks. And then, believe it or not, folks, I'm going to quiz you later on. So I don't want you to be shy. I don't want you to be embarrassed. There's no right or wrong. Well, there are right or wrong answers, but no one's judging you. You're here to learn. So let's start with the animals, and let's talk about some of those plantigrade animals. And if you recall, those plantigrade animals are the flat-footed animals. These are the animals that leave the whole track from the heel all the way up to the toes and the claws. And so there's a group of animals that walk flat-footed. So we'll start with one of my favorites. That's the bears. They are flat-footed animals. And so typically most animals have 5 toes. Flat-footed animals, these plantigrade animals, will leave a track that you typically see 5 toes. Now, something can go wrong and like a toe is up in the air or the substrate was hard in it, and you might only see 4 toes. But if you find enough tracks from that animal, you're going to see 5 toes in the impression. And so if you look at a bear track, this is typically what you see. Now, there is a slight difference between the front foot and the back foot. The back foot generally has this more elongated, more human-like shape to it with the whole heel. Sometimes you'll see a front foot that will have kind of a little ball on the end, which is the back palm of their front paw. But for the most part, what you're going to see is this big main oval for the main pad, and then you're going to see 5 toes wrapping around that main pad along with claw marks. That's a typical print from a bear. Black bears and grizzlies or brown bears have very similar looking prints. The main difference is the size. Obviously, a big brown bear is going to leave a much larger print, but there's also a little bit of differences in the positioning of the toes. I'm not getting too technical. That's the next class on tracking. But bears have a very standard looking print that most of you are probably aware of. So then that leads us to, again, these are all flat-footed animals. We have this little guy, the raccoon. They have a very distinctive print as well. Again, you see all 5 fingers. And it's very human-like, especially that very front foot of theirs. It looks almost like a human hand with those long fingers, and you can see the nail marks. The very end are the nail marks. Their back foot is much longer, but very, very much like a human. But you have to understand raccoons are much smaller, so it's going to be maybe an inch and a half at most with a lot of these raccoon tracks. Okay, Jan said she noticed black bears walking towards you. The front paws are pigeon-toed. That's a really good observation. Yes, brown bears do the same thing. Their front paws sometimes slant inward. Don't know why that is evolutionarily, but yes, you will definitely see some of those bears walking around with their front feet kind of slanted inwards. Okay, more plantigrade or flat-footed animals. Very common animal, especially in the East. Our good old buddy, the opossum. A lot of people call him a possum. A possum is actually an Australian animal. But if you look at their track, very, very distinctive. 5 toes again. Front toe or front pad or front foot looks very human-like. Even the back foot has that weird, funky looking thumb that extends outward. And so very, very distinctive track for the possum, the opossum. More animals. We have a beaver here. One of the key characteristics here, again, 5-fingered animal. And oftentimes you will see markings from the webbing on the foot. So obviously, if you see this webbing and you know it wasn't a goose or another waterfowl that walked in the area, if you see a track with the 5 toes and the webbing, obviously that's going to be a good indication that you're looking at a beaver. Now back to that lagomorph, and to give you an idea, remember, rabbits are real easy to understand. Everyone knows what a rabbit looks like. So you have these big oblong back feet, and then you've got those shorter front feet. The cool thing is the pattern that they leave. Again, those front feet tend to be in a straight line, where the back feet obviously are apart from each other. So whenever you see tracks that look like this on the right, you're dealing with some kind of rabbit, whether or not it's a rabbit, a jackrabbit, a hare, whatever it is. Another flat-footed animal is this guy, one of my favorites, a skunk. The cool thing with a skunk is their track looks very bear-like, but you have to understand, think of the size of that animal. So if you see these miniature looking bear tracks, there is a really good chance that could be a skunk. And so obviously the size of the track is going to be key for identifying that animal. But again, very bear-like in their track. One of the most common animals, the squirrels, you'll oftentimes see their footprints either on your windshield or somewhere on your back patio. Very indicative. Again, flat-footed animal. You see the 5 toes on the hind track. Sometimes you don't see the 5th toe show on their front pad. But again, you have to understand the size of that track. You should be able to make the differentiation. A weasel here. This is actually a least weasel. Again, flat-footed animal. You're going to see the 5 toes and the claw marks. Then you get into some of the more obscure mammals where you're looking at deer mice or rats or things like that. Very cool, awkward-looking type of track, but you'll see a lot of the prints will have the 5 toes in there because these animals all walk flat-footed. And so if you look at a track and you see 5 toes, you know you're only dealing with a specific group of animals. Now, obviously, when you're dealing with a mouse compared to a bear, the size of the track is going to give it away. But it's really interesting to note how that animal walks and the reason why it's leaving the track that it does. So those were basic examples of those flat-footed plantigrade animals. Now let's look at those digitigrade animals. These are the animals that walk up on their toes. Now, the cool thing with digitigrade, there's 2 primary groups of animals that walk like this. And the first group we mentioned before are the canids. And so we'll look at some of the canine tracks. And if you look at a canine track, you will never get the heel in a canine track. And so all it's going to consist of is you have this main pad, which would be like that top part of your foot right behind your toes, or I don't know if my video is still on, but it's just below the toes. So you get that main pad, which is right here, and you get the toes. And with the canines, you often get these claw marks. Now, the other primary group of digitigrade animals or toe walking animals are the felids or the cats. And so if you look at the cat track, you have the main pad here, you have the toes, and again, there's only 4 toes. on the cats and the dogs, but you're not going to get any claw marks. Now, a lot of people will go specifically by claw marks. So they'll look at a track and right away they'll see 4 toes. So it's usually, is it a cat or is it a dog? And most people will say, oh, if there's claw marks, it's a dog. If there's no claw marks, it's a cat. That is a good key, but sometimes, especially if you find the track in a really hard substrate, you might not see claw marks from a dog. Or if the cat was digging in, there's actually a potential that you could see the claw marks. And so the claw marks aren't the only thing. One of the best things that you can do is look at the shape of the pad. In fact, I think the shape of the main pad is more characteristic, more defining between canines and felines than anything else. So the canine, the top picture you see there, the main pad, at the top of the main pad, you have 1 hump. It's a single hump. And then you go down to the cat and you've got 2 humps. It literally forms the letter M. And if you look at the pad, if you have a cat and look at their pads, you'll see where their main pad is much wider and it has these 2 lumps. It's bilobed on the bottom. And so I always tell people it forms that letter M, and you think M for meow. So if you see that main pad form that letter M, more than likely you're dealing with a felid track or a cat track. So let's look at some of the animals that walk on their toes. So let's start with good old coyote. Now, all the canines are going to have very similar looking tracks, but you're going to see the 4 toes, you're going to see claw marks. And the key here, again, look at the main pad. You're going to see 1 hump at the top of the main pad. Now let's go to a fox track. And again, very similar thing where you're going to see 4 toes, you're going to see claw marks. And again, if you look at the pad, you're going to see 1 hump, the main part of the pad. Even on the back pad, even though it's a much, much thinner main pad here, you still see 1 hump. Then you go to the wolf. Very similar to a domestic dog. A domestic dog is literally just a wolf that's been domesticated. But again, 4 toes, main pad with 1 hump and claw marks. Now you can look at some tracks of different canines and you can sometimes differentiate. Sometimes you cannot differentiate between the 2. But let's start with the track in the middle, the dog. Oftentimes you'll hear or see photos. In fact, I'll show you one in a little bit. The nails on a domestic dog are usually very blunt and so it's not going to be a really pointy looking claw mark. So you're going to see these blunt claw marks. So typically that will give it away as a domestic dog. Another thing to look at for coyotes, like on the left-hand side, you see the bottom part of their pad kind of has this center lobe as opposed to the domestic dogs or the wolves. You see that center lobe there? That sometimes gives it away as a coyote. And then the fox here is where toe positioning really comes in. And so you see those 2 middle toes tend to be above the 2 toes on the side. And so there's, again, I don't want to get too deep into this because that can be a more advanced tracking class, but I think it's really cool that you can actually look at specific characteristics within a track to identify what species of canine it is. Okay, so let's switch over to the bobcat. Again, bobcat walks on its toes, so you're only going to see 4 toes. You usually do not see any claw marks whatsoever, but the key here is the top of that main pad. It's got 2 humps on it. Now, if you look at a cougar, which is obviously another cat, very similar looking track. You got the 4 toes, no claw marks, and you have the main pad with 2 humps on the top. Well, how do you differentiate between a cougar and a bobcat? Well, it's easy, folks, because you have a cougar, which is going to have a track that's generally usually larger than 3 inches. And those bobcat tracks are going to be much, much smaller, usually about 1.5 inches wide for a bobcat track. So if you have a cat track that's going to be 3 inches wide, typically you're dealing with a cougar. If you're in an area that has both cougars and bobcats, you got to look at the size of that track. Now, again, this will give you a good visual of not just the difference between the cat tracks and the canine tracks with a coyote, because you see the claw marks, but just look at the overall size of that cougar track compared to a bobcat compared to a coyote. And so once you begin doing this, and I know it sounds overwhelming, but once you start looking at and seeing more and more of these tracks, it starts clicking right away, because you'll look at a track and right away you'll see the M in that main pad. So you're dealing with a cat track. And then you start saying, okay, well, what kind of cat could it be? And so it really does get easier the more you do it. So last but not least, let's look at those animals that walk on their nails or their hooves, those unguligrade animals. And so you have an animal like a white-tailed deer. Now I will tell you, white-tailed deer track, most people know what they look like. Mule deer will leave a very similar looking track to a whitetail. And so just so you know what you're seeing here, these are the main hooves, those two big parts with they're pointy on one end and rounded on the other. Sometimes you'll see these two marks behind it. Those are what we call the dew claws. And so this animal is facing, I don't want to say going up, but the animal is going in this direction towards the up. Because those dew claws are in the back part of that animal's. In fact, if you look at the picture here, you can see the dew claw on the front hoof there and on the back hoofs there. Sometimes if you're in soft enough substrate, you'll see those dew claws hit. A lot of times you don't, especially if it's a firmer substrate, they don't sink in that much, and you'll only see the hoof parts. So what other animals are unguligrade? Obviously we have elk, very similar track. You might have a little bit more spacing between the dew claws. You have bighorn sheep. Oftentimes you don't see the dew claws, you just see the hoof parts, but all those animals that have hooves, from bison to pronghorn to sheep to goats to deer, they all have these very similar looking hoof marks. So you got to look at the size of the track to differentiate what kind of animal it is. Now, having said that, one of the biggest things that you have to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out what animal made the track is you have to know what animals live in your area. And this is one of my biggest pet peeves. And if you know me, you know how often I talk about this. So let's look at some range maps. These are range maps of different animals that we will find in North America. And it just gets to me when people will identify the track and they will call it an animal that is not even found in your area. And so you have to use that piece of information to help you make the best guess possible. So I looked up the ranges of a couple of different animals here. Now, I'll give you this one on the bottom left. I mentioned this animal before, but this is the range of that animal. Let me see if anyone can guess it. It is one of the smaller plantigrade or flat-footed animals. So can anyone recognize that range and tell me what animal is only found mostly in the East Coast and on the far western part of the United States? Can anyone take a guess? Okay, I'll give you a hint. It has that weird looking thumb. Good guess, Jan, but coyotes are now pretty much everywhere throughout North America. Believe it or not, very good, Jane. The possum is primarily found in the East Coast. It ranges all the way to about the start of the Rockies, but there's a big gap in the Rockies all the way to the eastern edge of California, Washington, Oregon. But there's a good chunk of the West that is devoid of opossums. And so if you're in Montana, odds are you're not going to be looking at an opossum track. So knowing the range of the animal is key. Okay, what about the map, the top middle? You see a big population of animals in the Western Great Lakes, in the Greater Yellowstone area, and then in southern, in the Southwest along the Arizona, New Mexico border. What range do you think that is? Or what kind of animal? Very good. Patricia and Trish got it. Everyone got it. So yeah, if you're finding canine tracks in Georgia, don't be thinking that you're looking at a wolf, because wolves, free-ranging wolves, are not found in that area. And just so you know, I did see Mary mentioned about possums being in Minnesota. I will tell you, just be very careful with range maps, especially around the periphery, because they change. They'll publish these maps. Now, they typically don't change drastically, but you'll get states added as animals expand their territory. Just look at coyotes. 100 years ago, coyotes were primarily restricted to the Midwest and the Southwest. And now over time, they're pretty much found everywhere. Another good example is armadillos. Everyone knows how quickly armadillos are expanding, but you're not going to see a flip-flop where you find them in the East one year and then 2 years later, you only find them in the West. So range maps, you have to understand, will change over time. And then last but not least, I'm sure everyone knows the map in the bottom right is very good. Everyone knew that. The cougars, that's pretty much where you have breeding populations of cougars. Yes, cats can travel. Cougars can travel long distances. We had one show up in Connecticut. We had one show up in Tennessee. We had one of those Florida Panthers end up in along the Alabama-Georgia line. And so those cats can travel great distances, but the best way to go about identifying an animal track is go with the most common, most reasonable track it could be. Don't try to think of some obscure, oh my gosh, there's an African lion on the loose type of guess there, because usually the animal most likely to make the track is the animal that made the track. Okay, moving on. Sorry for my pontification there. So I'm going to mention, we just talked about the science, and there's a whole lot of science, a whole lot to think about. I promise you, the more you do it, the easier it will get. But let's talk a little bit about the art of animal tracking, because literally what you have to do is, when you become good at animal tracking, you have to paint a picture. You have to visualize the story. You have to visualize what happened, what animal made that track, and what was it doing. So you kind of have to be an artist to figure out what was going on before you. And so the key here, like I said, is visualizing that story. And I always hated when people would send me a picture of a track, and usually it was a very bad picture of a track, and they're like, what is it? Most of the time I'd say, I have no idea, because usually when you're trying to do some animal tracking or figure out what kind of animal it was, there's a lot of sleuthing you have to do. You have to look for multiple tracks. You have to look for the pattern of the track. You have to look at the habitat it was in. And you can't do that when someone sends you a single track that is pretty much undiscernible. And so there is this art form to it. So the first thing you have to do is, when you're out there walking along and you find some tracks, you got to start painting that picture. You say, okay, here's a track of an animal. And so there's more to that story. So, well, instead of, as you look around, instead of just being that one track, you notice it's multiple sets of tracks, and they're identical tracks. So right away you're like, okay, they're two similar kinds of animals and they're running together. Obviously, you know, certain animals are usually solitary animals, so you don't have groups of animals or packs of animals running together. And then you look at the habitat they're in, you're like, okay, we're out west, so to speak. So that's gonna bring in a certain kind of animal, only Western animals. And then as you paint that picture and you realize you're walking along with your two dogs, it's interesting to recreate the story. And the more you do this, the better you become. And so there is this form of art that is necessary for recreating what happened as to why those tracks are laid out the way they are. So believe it or not, sometimes visualizing the story is easy. And so I'm going to show you, and this will be one picture, but there's lots of components to the picture. So you tell me what happened here. Great guess, Trish. Now, it would probably be impossible to discern what kind of bird, but yes, that's exactly what happened. You see tracks of some kind of small mammal, and lo and behold, a bird, whether or not it was a hawk, an owl, an eagle, whatever it was, came down and snatched that animal. An owl is a great guess. And so sometimes it's easy to put all the pieces together to figure out what happened. Sometimes it's not so easy. So what we're going to do is I just threw a laundry load of things at you to swallow. You're probably drinking from a fire hose there. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to quiz you, and I'm hopefully going to make you feel good about tracking. So what I want you to do, by all means, if you want to unmute your microphone or type something in the chat, either way, I'm going to throw some pictures of tracks out there, and I want you to guess what they are, and then we'll talk about each one. So we're going to start super easy. Actually, we won't start with that. That's my son. That's my son walking at White Sands. Okay, how about this one? What do you think this is a track from?
Rabbit.
Very good. So you look at the track on the right, you see those two big hind feet. And again, those front feet tend to line up with each other. But the reason I put the picture on the right is to show you the locomotion. This wasn't like a standard walking gait. You see the animal makes a leap from this point to this point. So something like that will definitely give you an idea. If you didn't immediately recognize it as a rabbit, you can see that it's hopping from one place to another. Okay, that was relatively easy. All right, what do we got here?
Bear.
Very good. Both Jan and Trish got it. Can't really, well, I don't know where this photograph was taken, but you can see the size of it. Obviously, you have human prints there. So, you know, it can't be a skunk because they're just way too big, but that's a standard bear track. All right, what do you see here?
Deer.
Yep,
Deer.
Very good. Piece of cake. Everyone knows what deer look like. Okay, what kind of animal is this?
Canine.
Domestic dog.
Now, who said domestic dog and why?
Jan said domestic dog. And why? My gut feeling.
Okay, well, the good news is you're correct, because obviously it's a canine. You got the four toes and you got the main pad with that single hump. The nails showing, Trish, very good. But one thing, look how
They're blind.
yes,
Yeah.
how blunt those are. That I took a picture of that was actually Brooklyn, my lab. But typically when you have coyote or even when not many people are going to see wolf tracks, they're not as flat or not as blunt as those. They tend to be much sharper. Very good, guys. Okay, that's a series of tracks there. It's hard to see, but there's a better one. What do you think left those tracks? I'm going to have you think outside the box.
Wild turkey.
Very good. And so many people know what a bird track looks like. You got those three prongs in the front. Sometimes you got a prong in the back. But yeah, if you see tracks like this, oftentimes, especially turkeys are found pretty much throughout North America. And they are what we call upland game birds. So they walk around a lot. They don't fly as much as the other birds. So believe it or not, tracks are not just meant for mammals. There are bird tracks as well. Okay, I took this photo a couple years ago. Can anyone guess what this is? At least what type of animal is it?
Feline.
Very, very good. I don't know who said that, but if you look, you got the
No,
four
claw
toes.
marks.
Yeah, it's kind of hard because the sand is kicked up here, but there are no claw marks. But the main identifying thing, look at that rear pad or the main pad. It's got like that M shape to it. So this is a great example because this is where you need some type of perspective. You need some scale in that picture, because if I were to send you this picture, or if someone sent me this picture, I can't tell if that's a cougar track, a bobcat, or a domestic house cat, because there's nothing to give it scale. I will tell you, since I took this picture, I knew this to be a bobcat because this was only about 1.5 inches across. They look much bigger, but this was a bobcat that was walking in the sand. Okay, here's a good one. What do you think this is?
Possum.
Very, very good. It's got that awkward looking thumb.
Looks like a thumb that if you were snow skiing, you displaced your thumb when you fell.
Yeah, it kind of does look like that. Okay, I'm gonna fool someone, and believe it or not, the person that sent me this photo is on this call, so you can't speak up just yet. Any idea what kind of track that is? Chat's pretty quiet too. And this is a very great way to show why it's often quite difficult to determine what it is when someone sends you one picture, because again, a lot of times I'll get a single photograph and they'll say, what is this? And it could be lots of things.
Are
Here,
the
let me show you the rest.
the track, or those round things further out part of it?
This was next to
a
it.
rabbit.
Nope. What it was a deer track, but this original track on the right, there was 2 tracks laid on top of each other. And so it kind of looked like a 3-toed track. And so sometimes people will send me these tracks and they're like, there's 5 toes, but believe it or not, I wish I could have remembered to save them, but sometimes you'll have canines step in the same track and it looks like they might have 5 toes and they're wondering what's going on. You have to be very mindful of it's called a double register. It's where they register the footprint in the same location, and it could really distort the track and add characteristics that aren't really there. So that was a deer track. Thank you, Melissa, for sending me that last year. Okay, what kind of animal is this from?
Feline.
Feline. Again, the main thing I look for is that double hump in the main pad. The one thing I forgot to mention, and you can see it in this track, it's really cool with felines. Canine tracks, oftentimes, like if you don't see claw marks, obviously that could lean towards feline, but that does not rule out a canine, because the substrate or something might not have left noticeable claw marks. But canine tracks are very, very symmetrical. The thing with a feline track, and you'll see the final picture on my slideshow, you usually see a leading toe. It's one of the second toes in. If you see, this toe is a little bit further ahead than the other toe. The middle 2 toes, there's one toe that's a little bit more ahead of the other toe. And I'll show you a good picture of that later.
Daryl, what about doing this off memory, so I may be wrong, but isn't there just one large cat that cannot retract its claws, so the claws would be visible? Is it a cheetah?
If it is not a North American cat. I do know all the North American cats do have retractable claws, but you could be correct in that. But if it's an African cat, I don't know which one it is. But
Okay, I'm sort of into African cats, so I'll look it up and let you know. So
okay, I appreciate that. Okay, here are some tracks see if you can figure out what these are. And I did teach these. So right away, what kind of animal left this? How many toes do we have? Now, some of these you can't see this track. So look at this track, this track. How many toes we got showing?
5. 5.
Nope, we got 4. Believe this is the main pad. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Main pad 1, 2, 3, 4. So we got 4 toes showing. So it's either canine or feline. This one's bad because you can't see claw marks. But if you look at the main pad, it's a single hump. So these are canine tracks of some sort. And so now that you know they're canine tracks, believe it or not, this track you could actually discern what species it is. Now, coyotes and foxes often have these smaller main pads. But if you remember, you can draw a line, those middle 2 toes on a fox, they're in front of the 2 side toes. And so they're much further in front of those 2 side toes, and you can almost get a line in between there. So these are fox tracks. So it's kind of cool. Again, a lot of times you're not going to have this much detail. That'd be near impossible to tell what it is. But when you do have that detail, it's neat to find out. Okay, here, we'll put it this way. Here's another canine track. You can tell it's a canine. You got the M as the main pad. You have a leading toe, so you know this is a cat. But let me give you some scale here.
Bobcat.
Believe it or not, this is it's a cougar track, a smaller cougar, but you're going to be about 2 inches, at least 2 inches wide on this main pad. And so it's not a really large cougar, but it's too large to be a bobcat. The bobcat is usually only about 1.5 inches wide on the pad. It would be better if it was a ruler instead of a glove, but okay, what do you think this is a track of? Very good point, Trish. When you have tracks in snow, those tracks can be distorted quite a bit.
Raccoon?
Very good. Was that Jan?
Yes.
Very good. Yes, that is a raccoon track.
Again, when I answer fast, it's just my gut instinct.
Nope, that's good. Okay, here's another feline track. Now look at this is a bobcat track. So look how small that is. It's not even like a finger width as compared to, let me go back to, this one's about, the pad there is at least 2 fingers wide. And so it gives you a little bit more idea of the size of a bobcat. So bobcats generally have much smaller prints than a cougar. Okay, another really easy one.
Deer.
Yep. Okay.
Yes. Deer.
This is one where we can't see the actual track, but what would you guess this to be?
Straight line.
Rabbit again.
Well, the rabbit, you would probably see 2 of the big feet. Like this here looks like those front feet, but you're not seeing any of the hind feet because the hind feet are spaced apart. So this would either be a fox or a coyote walking in that straight line. Remember, their tracks usually line up much more so than, say, a domestic dog. They're not as wide in the chest.
What about a moose, Daryl? Does it look like the deer, only much larger?
Much larger. In fact, you'll see one before we're done. We don't have to anymore, but okay, this is going back. You saw this track before, but this is to give you an idea. If you saw this track for the first time, what kind of animal left it? Because there's very discernible pieces of information here. First, you look at the main pad, and it comes to that single hump. You could also kind of see the teardrop look to the toes, and that teardrop it was a claw mark that kind of blended in or faded in with the toe. So that teardrop mark would be indicative of claw marks there that you can't really see too well, but the main pad is that single hump. And so you can even get a really bad looking track that you can absolutely identify as to what kind of animal it was.
That was one of your dogs, wasn't it? And I have to say on that one, it looks like it melted, but when you first showed it,
Yep.
it also looked like a pictograph, like a cave drawing. Cause look back, if you're not looking at the track, but I looked off to the upper right,
Yep.
that on the right looks like some kind of
Oh yeah.
long pronged animal, like a cave drawing or something
Yeah, I can see that.
when it's out of context.
Okay, another easy one. Can't
Bear.
really see the
Bear,
numbers. Yeah, that's a bear.
definitely.
Okay, tricky one. What do you think this is?
That's that three-toed deer, isn't it?
No, this one is tricky. Put it this way, they get smeared. That was actually Roadrunner tracks. Because you could almost see the footprints, but the tail drag of those tail feathers kind of leaves those tracks. So those were actually Roadrunner tracks. Okay. Let me tell you first and foremost, this is the scale. These are really, really tiny tracks. But the thing to note here is you can see a tail drag. And so you have some type of either mouse or a rat. Very good, Trish. Or potentially a rat, or just some kind of really tiny mammal with a long tail. All right, what do we got here?
Bear.
Bear.
Oh, wait,
Ah,
not
Yeah.
not the small ones. The big look like bear.
the big ones are bear, but you have bear tracks and canine tracks in there. And I would guess that's a good chance. I forget where this picture came from, but that could be wolf, especially if those are grizzly tracks. But a lot of people would look at it and say, "Oh, it's a big bear and a cub," but no, the smaller track is actually a canine track.
Yeah.
Not too discernible, but can you guess what left that? Long fingers like that? And you can see a human footprint here. So these are relatively small, maybe an inch.
Raccoon.
Very good, raccoon. Then we're back to the displaced.
Opossum.
Awesome.
All right. What about this? I don't
That's
know,
a
Melissa, did you
tail
send this?
drag also.
Yeah, that's okay. That is your foot. Okay. What do we have here? 5 toes. Now, so it's not a canine, it's not a feline because you got the 5 toes and you can see the claw marks. What these look like are miniature bear tracks, but these are tiny. These are just over an inch.
Badger.
Nope. I mentioned it earlier. They look like little bear tracks. Very good, Melissa.
A skunk.
A skunk is very much indicative. They look like just miniature bear tracks. Okay, this one's easy.
Snake.
Snake.
Very good. All right.
Turkey.
I'll give I don't know. I'll give a gold star to who gets this.
Turkey.
No.
Wild turkey.
Look at the size of that. That is much larger than a wild
Eagle.
not an eagle, but an animal, a bird that walks quite a bit on the ground. That is actually from a great blue heron, believe it or not.
Oh.
Okay,
Oh darn! I thought it was a green heron.
here's an interesting one. What's going on here? What kind of tracks do we have here?
A deer and a bear.
Believe it or not, it is a moose and a bear.
Oh.
So there's a good chance it could be a grizzly.
The water also gives an indication it might be a moose, right?
Yes, it walks right into the water. But someone, when I first saw this photo, someone said, "Ooh, the grizzly's tracking the moose." What says that's not the case?
Because it passes up the moose. It keeps going. It looks like on the shoreline, and the moose took a left into the water.
Well, the moose could have kept walking in the water and the bear could have kept following it. But what gives it away that the bear was not tracking the moose? What direction is the bear walking?
Oh, they're going different directions?
Yeah, because you see
The moose came out of the water.
Yep, you see the dew claws. So the moose was walking towards us and the bear was walking away.
So very likely not at the same time.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely if they were this close, there would have been a lot more.
Hello, see you later.
But yeah,
I'm hungry.
I think it's wonderful that the more you look at this and you can start identifying things quicker and quicker, and then you pick up on more things like, oh, that animal's going in that direction, or that animal is running, or that animal is walking. And so it's kind of
Well,
cool.
at first the moose looked like the cloven things looked pointy, like going the same direction as the bear. But then when I looked at them closer, you can see the dew claws.
Yeah, remember
back, right?
the dew claws are in the back of the foot. So
which lets you know. Yeah.
Okay. This is another thing where the picture, it would be hard to discern, like if you received this and
A
that's all
sea turtle.
there you go. Very good.
Was I right?
Yeah.
That was gut instinct, but it's dragging
Yep.
the bottom of its plate, and its flippers are making all those dig-ins.
Yep, going right into the water. Okay, here's my bonus question because I didn't teach what this is. This is actually a three-toed track. So it's not a double register.
The only thing that comes to mind is a three-toed sloth, but they're not on the ground really.
These are all North American animals. Can anyone guess?
3 toes.
Okay, I'll give you a hint. They are rapidly expanding their range eastward. Jane, you should know this I don't know if Jane's still here.
Is it a bird?
Nope.
Okay.
Believe it or not, this is a track from, very good, Jane. That is an armadillo track. And so you can see the quarter there, which gives you a good idea that it's a pretty small track. But an armadillo they have 4 toes, but you'll typically only see 3 of their toes. And so a lot of people on the East Coast are going to see more and more. They're definitely expanding their range.
What about, can you tell? Because when I usually see them, when you've come upon them, sometimes they get afraid and they roll up in a ball. Does that leave a track?
I'm sure it would leave a mark of some sort, but they tend not to roll around in it. So it's not like their escape.
And their tail doesn't show up? I would think so, because they don't raise it in the air.
It might. Sometimes they'll walk with their tail up, but yeah, there definitely could be a tail drag, because just picture what the armadillo looks like and you can definitely get a tail drag in there. And speaking of tail,
question on the armadillo, what's its current range?
I don't have the range map in my slideshow, but the thing is they're all ready to think of where Eastern Tennessee is. They have started showing up there. And so they primarily came from the Midwest, but they've been expanding their range. I know 15 years ago, like, you were just hearing of them crossing the Mississippi. And now they've expanded all the way to the Eastern Tennessee area. And so I put it this way, I bet you within another decade or two, they're going to be all the way to the coast.
Okay, the reason I ask is when we lived in Florida, we would see them in Florida all the time.
Yeah, I think those southern states definitely had them, but they're not only expanding eastward, but they're heading northward as well.
Okay.
And
they've been in Texas as long as I can remember.
Yes, they're definitely that Midwest, Southwest type of species. But the thing is, you have to understand that climate change is impacting lots of wildlife. I'm a wildlife biologist. One of the things I deal with most is what this change in climate is going to do for species, because there's some species that I don't want to get too technical, but some of the species are what we call Pleistocene relics. And so they survive from the ice age, and some of the species are just like at the top of the mountains. And as those mountains get warmer, they tend to go up higher in elevation so they can keep that same type of climate that they're used to. But the problem is those mountains are going to run out of space. And so we're going to start losing some species due to climate change that are going higher up in elevation. But along with that, there's some animals that will also migrate north to south or east to west to try to find those areas that are more to their liking.
And same with plants. Some of the USDA zones are changing,
Yep.
or they're becoming an A or B or C or something.
Okay, here's another small rodent with a tail drag. Don't know if it was a mouse or what it was, but you can definitely see the tail drag. This one's easy. That's my Jeep. But what I'm going to do, I am going to end this slideshow. I got to give photo credits. See, Melissa, I even credited you for some of those photos. But that is the bottom of a cat. I think that is a mountain lion, but you can see that leading toe. One of those middle toes is a little bit more forward than the others. And you can see the very distinctive pad shape there. So anyway, you all know how to follow us. Most of you here have seen this before. We do have our webpage. We also have done a podcast, which I hate to admit, we stopped doing those for about a month or two because my partner is in the middle of building a house and is just tied up tremendously. The best thing to do though is follow us on Facebook. We always enjoy the comments we get. Doesn't matter if it's good or bad. Let us know how we're doing. We finally released our end of 2022 schedule. And so these are the classes coming up. Next week, I'm going to be teaching the wildfire class, but there's our slew of classes. We do have 2 undetermined. I'm going to be doing a big event in October, so those dates are a little up in the air as well as the topic. But if you know, I got to pay out of pocket for the web hosting and just a lot of the stuff we do costs money. So we do have memberships so you can get in on these live classes. But obviously, if you're a first timer, we love offering this class for free. But mark your calendars, 2 weeks from today, I'm going to be doing a discussion on wildfire, because a lot of people think any forest fire is bad, and that is not the case. It is the natural way of rejuvenating and refreshing and resetting the natural way of things. So wildfire is definitely a topic that I think a lot of people have a lot of misunderstandings about. So we'll be teaching that class in a couple of weeks. We teach a lot of classes here. These are some of the classes. And so, as you know, I always say this on our podcast, remember, when it comes to wildlife, folks, your knowledge often means their existence. So, all right. Sorry I dragged on that quiz for so long, but do y'all have any questions on tracking? The more you do it, I promise you, the easier it will get, and it'll start clicking and clicking and clicking, and you'll get there. It seems daunting in the beginning, but you'll definitely get there. Anyone have any questions?
No, it'd be nice to have a field class.
Well, that's kind of what I'm doing. I started doing it a couple of years ago, Jan, and I'm doing it again this year. I called it the Green Fire Tour, and it was kind of in honor of Aldo Leopold, who was the father of wildlife conservation. And he was the one that wrote the Sand County Almanac and Thinking Like a Mountain. And he mentioned about seeing the green fire in the wolf's eye die. And he knew that was the wrong thing to do. So anyway, I started doing these field classes. It costs quite a bit of money, but for a week, I will be taking folks throughout some really cool places in the West. 2 years ago, I took them around northern New Mexico. This year, I'm taking them in southern Colorado. But I'll I'll keep you posted on when those things come up if you ever want to join in. So
Okay.
anyway, I thank you all for joining in. Sorry it was such a long class. I try not to drag it out, but I get to rambling, and so I apologize for that. Anyway, if you don't have any other questions, I'm going to stop the recording and hope to see you guys next week, or in 2 weeks. I'm sorry about that. So, all right, take what you learned and put it to use, and we'll see you, and I'll keep quizzing you next time I see you.